The air in the bustling airport terminal felt thick with tension, yet one man stood out, a black CEO, poised yet clearly uneasy. His crisp suit, tailored to perfection, contrasted with the casual attire of those around him. His polished shoes clicked against the tile floor as he moved with purpose, yet every glance from the predominantly white crowd felt like an accusation. But it wasn't the stares that rattled him, it was the moment he'd be forced to confront. A simple mistake. A phone call that spiraled out of control. What happened next would change his life forever, and the world would soon be forced to question everything they thought they knew about power, race, and authority. The police didn't seem to care about his title. They didn't care about his status. They only saw what was skin deep. What followed was the kind of injustice that no one ever expected at such a high level. He was detained, wrongfully handcuffed right in front of stunned onlookers, a humiliating reminder that in America, even the most powerful black men can be treated as criminals on sight. Now, as he sat, his hands cuffed behind him, a new reality set in. This wasn't just about one bad experience at an airport. This was the harsh truth about the systemic racism woven into the fabric of everyday life. His phone call to the Pentagon only deepened the gravity of his situation. This wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a full-fledged violation of his rights. He had no idea that this moment would be the spark for a firestorm that would shake the foundations of corporate America, ultimately shattering the careers of those who tried to cover it up. But there was no going back now. He had already made the call. And the world would soon know the truth. This was only the beginning. The air in the airport terminal buzzed with the usual energy, but for one black CEO, it was anything but ordinary. Dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, he moved with an air of confidence, but every step felt like it echoed louder than the last. Around him, people went about their business, unaware of the tension simmering beneath the surface. His polished shoes clicked sharply against the cold tile floor, his every movement deliberate. But then, just as quickly as he entered, everything changed. The police came at him without warning. No questions. No concerns for his identity. In an instant, the very system he had fought to rise above was ready to bring him down. The cuffs snapped shut around his wrists. His mind raced, but he kept his composure. It didn't matter who he was, or what he had achieved, he was a black man in America, and to them, that was all that mattered. His call to the Pentagon, one made in a desperate bid for clarity, only seemed to escalate the situation. He felt the weight of their disbelief as they ignored his plea. In that moment, it became painfully clear, this wasn't an isolated incident, it was systemic. It wasn't about the individual. It was about the systems that were built to oppress. But the story didn't end there. As he sat, handcuffed in the terminal, a thought crossed his mind, this was just the beginning. What they didn't know was that this CEO would fight back, not only for himself but for every black person who had ever been overlooked, disregarded, or worse, mistreated. The journey that began with an unjust arrest would ignite a chain of events that would challenge everything he once believed about power, race, and justice. The truth was, the world would soon learn that when the system fails, those who break it have the power to change it forever. As the handcuffs dug into his wrists, the weight of the situation began to settle in. The world around him seemed to fade into a blur of confusion and disbelief, but for him, everything was crystal clear. He had worked tirelessly to rise to this point, to build a name, a reputation, and an empire from the ground up. Now, here he was, treated like a criminal, not for anything he had done, but for the color of his skin. The officers, who had been stern and forceful since their arrival, showed no signs of mercy. His mind raced. He had come from nothing, fought against the odds, but none of that mattered now. The system he had trusted, the one that had allowed him to break barriers and reach the heights of success, had turned against him in an instant. And in that moment, something inside him snapped. He could feel the injustice burning deep within his chest, a rage he had never allowed himself to feel. This was bigger than him now. He wasn't just a CEO, he was a symbol of something much larger. The world would soon see that. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he reached for it as he was shoved roughly into a chair. His fingers trembled as he unlocked it. The screen lit up with the name of someone from the Pentagon. A surge of adrenaline shot through him. This was his chance. He had to speak out, to expose the truth of what was happening. The call connected, but the voice on the other end was calm, almost indifferent, a tone that only made his frustration grow. "Yes, sir." "What can I do for you?" the voice asked, as if it were just another routine call. "I'm being detained here at the airport," he said, his voice steady despite the tension building within him. "They're treating me like a criminal. I need someone to get me out of here, now." The response came quickly, but it was not what he expected. "I'm afraid I can't assist you with this matter, sir. It's out of my hands." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Out of his hands? How could this be happening? He had fought his whole life to get to this point, to prove himself in a world that constantly tried to hold him back, and now, when it mattered most, those in power turned their backs on him. The police officers exchanged glances, one of them sneering as he muttered something under his breath. "Figures," he said, clearly referring to the man's race, as if it were all part of the plan. He could feel the heat rising in his chest. The call ended with a click, and the hopelessness began to settle in. But it didn't break him. Not yet. He refused to let them win. This wasn't just an isolated incident. This was a reflection of the reality that black people faced every day, a reality that he had been shielded from by his success, but one that was now crashing down around him. It wasn't just his career on the line, it was his very humanity. He was trapped in a system designed to keep him down, and yet, he still believed there was a way out. The fight was far from over. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity as the officers stood around him, their eyes scanning him with a judgment he had come to know all too well. The handcuffs, cold and biting, were a cruel reminder of the power they held over him, and yet, despite everything, a sense of defiance began to grow within him. His mind refused to accept this reality, not the man he had fought so hard to become. He had built an empire, he had changed the lives of thousands, and now, here he was, a victim of a system that could not see past the color of his skin. He had always known that this country's history was steeped in racism, but never had it felt so personal, so raw. It was a slap in the face. And the more he thought about it, the angrier he became. His phone buzzed again. He looked at the screen and saw the name of his lawyer flashing across the display. Without hesitation, he answered. "What's going on? Are you okay?" The voice on the other end was laced with concern. "I'm fine, but I need your help. I'm at the airport, and I've been detained. They've got me in handcuffs like I'm some kind of criminal," he said, his voice low but steady. "What?" The shock in his lawyer's voice was evident. "How did this happen?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know. I didn't do anything wrong. They just started asking questions, and before I knew it, they had me in cuffs. They're refusing to let me go." He paused, the weight of the situation settling back in. "This is bad, really bad. I'm not sure what to do." "Stay calm," the lawyer said quickly. "I'm on my way. I'll get someone to make some calls, get this cleared up." But as the call ended, the CEO's thoughts turned darker. He knew that the lawyer would try, but there was no guarantee of anything. He had seen this happen before, to others, and the outcome was rarely in their favor. His position as a black man in America made him a target, no matter how much wealth or success he had accumulated. The system was rigged against him. He could feel the weight of the moment crushing him, but in the pit of his stomach, something else began to form a resolve. He wasn't going to let them break him. He couldn't. Not now. Not after everything he had worked for. The officers stood by, their silence deafening, but he could hear the judgment in the way they looked at him. He refused to let them see his fear. He wasn't the one who should be afraid. It was them. He had a story to tell, one that no one would be able to ignore. The thought of his career being destroyed, of his name dragged through the mud, stoked the fire within him. This was bigger than just one man, it was about the fight for justice. The fight for every black person who had ever been wronged, overlooked, or marginalized. His situation was the embodiment of the systemic injustice that had plagued his people for centuries, but it was also the spark for change. It was time for him to make his move, to use his power in a way he had never imagined. He wasn't going to let them win. Not today. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours, and yet no one came to his aid. His lawyer had called back, but all he could offer was empty promises. "I've made some calls. They're working on it, but it'll take time," the lawyer had said, though it didn't provide any comfort. Time, in this moment, was not on his side. The cold steel of the handcuffs pressed against his skin, and the ache from his wrists was beginning to settle in. His mind raced, the frustration mounting with each passing second. Every breath felt heavier than the last, as though the weight of the entire world had suddenly shifted onto his shoulders. The officers continued to stand around him, their eyes scanning him with a level of suspicion that made his skin crawl. He had always known that racial profiling was a reality, but now it was happening to him. The very man who had clawed his way to the top, who had proven that black excellence could thrive even in the most unforgiving spaces. Yet here he was, sitting in an airport terminal, helpless, treated as if his accomplishments meant nothing. He tried to shake off the gnawing sense of helplessness, but it clung to him, suffocating him. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a wake-up call. The world he had worked so hard to build, the life he had fought for, felt like it was slipping through his fingers. He was angry, but even more than that, he was scared. The fear was a quiet thing at first, a creeping sense of vulnerability that he had never allowed himself to feel before. But as time went on, that fear grew louder, and the truth of the situation became undeniable. He was at their mercy. The system that had rewarded him for his hard work, his dedication, had now betrayed him. But he couldn't let that fear control him. He couldn't let it break him. He had come too far for that. As he sat there, staring at the ground, his mind began to formulate a plan. He had fought tooth and nail for every opportunity that had come his way, and he wasn't about to let this be the end of his story. The anger that had been building within him began to solidify into something more focused, a determination. He would not let this moment define him. He would fight back. But not just for himself. This was bigger than him. This was about every black man and woman who had been unjustly treated, overlooked, or oppressed. This was about shining a light on the very systems that had kept them down for generations. And so, as the officers continued to stand around him, oblivious to the storm that was brewing inside him, he made a decision. He would not remain silent. He would not be another statistic. His career, his reputation, his very identity, was on the line, but so was something much bigger. It was time to take a stand. And he would do it in the only way he knew how, through sheer will, through his unwavering resolve to make them see him for who he truly was. A force to be reckoned with. The longer he sat there, the more the tension in the room seemed to rise. The officers continued to stand by, indifferent to his discomfort. Their eyes remained fixed on him, cold and calculating, as if they were waiting for him to make the wrong move. But he had no intention of giving them the satisfaction. The anger inside him was no longer just an emotion, it had become a force, a driving engine that propelled him forward. He had been reduced to nothing in their eyes, but he would not let them see his defeat. His mind was sharp, cutting through the fog of fear and frustration. He had built his career on the principle that no one could dictate his worth, no matter their race, background, or prejudice. And this was no different. He would not let them strip away what he had worked so hard to achieve. His reputation, his name, his legacy, it all meant something. It wasn't just for him, it was for every black person who had been overlooked, dismissed, or held back. He had to make sure that his story didn't end here, not in this cold, sterile airport terminal, in the most dehumanizing way possible. His phone buzzed again, and for a split second, he almost didn't want to answer. He knew what it would be, another call from his lawyer, telling him things were moving, but at a pace that felt too slow for his liking. But then he remembered, this was his fight now, and he wasn't going to wait for someone else to fix it. He reached for the phone and answered with a calmness that belied the storm brewing inside him. Yes? I've escalated the situation, the lawyer said urgently, but you need to stay calm. They're coming, but we need you to be patient for just a little while longer. The words were meant to reassure him, but they did little to ease the growing tension. Patience? How could he be patient when every second that ticked by felt like a betrayal of everything he had fought for? He had spent years being patient, waiting for his moment to prove himself, and now it seemed like his moment was slipping away. But he couldn't let that happen. He knew what was at stake. His name was his brand, his company, his entire legacy. It had taken years to build, and now it was all threatened by a moment of racial profiling. The thought made him sick. He could feel the resentment building up inside him, each passing second adding more fuel to the fire. But he refused to let it consume him. He was better than that. He had been trained for moments like this, moments of pressure, moments of crisis. He had faced them before, in boardrooms, in negotiations, in battles for equity. This was just another fight, just a different battlefield. And he wasn't about to lose it. He sat back, steeling himself, and focused on his next move. He knew that now was the time to act, to take control of the narrative before it was twisted beyond recognition. He would not be the victim here. He would not let them define him. As the minutes dragged on, he began to formulate a plan, one that would not only get him out of this situation, but would shine a light on the larger issue at play, the deep-seated, systemic racism that had ensnared him. He would fight back, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been silenced, for everyone who had been forced to endure this kind of injustice. This was his moment to make a stand. And he wasn't going to let it slip away. The minutes seemed to stretch into an eternity, each second that passed amplifying the tension in the room. The officers remained silent, standing just a few feet away from him, their cold, unblinking stares making it clear that they saw him not as a man but as an enemy. He could feel the weight of their judgment on him, the unspoken belief that his worth was determined by the color of his skin, not his accomplishments. But the anger that had been simmering inside him was no longer a quiet undercurrent. It was a roaring fire now, and it gave him the strength to stand taller, to hold his ground. He had always known that racism was pervasive, woven into the very fabric of society, but to feel it so acutely, to be on the receiving end of such blatant prejudice, was something he had never truly experienced before. It was maddening. He had spent years fighting to break barriers, to prove that a black man could not only succeed in the corporate world but thrive. Yet, in this moment, none of that mattered. None of his success, his wealth, or his reputation had protected him. He was just another black man in the eyes of these officers, nothing more, nothing less. The thought of it made his blood boil. He had worked for everything he had, never allowing his race to define him, and yet here he was, reduced to nothing by the very system he had always fought to transcend. His phone buzzed again, interrupting his thoughts. This time, it was a call from his assistant. He had half a mind to ignore it, to focus solely on the injustice unfolding before him, but he knew that ignoring it could cause more problems. He answered, his voice steady but tinged with frustration. "What's going on?" he asked, his tone betraying the tension he felt. "We've contacted the airport authorities, but they're saying they have no record of your detention," his assistant replied. "What do you mean, no record?" His voice grew tighter with disbelief. "They've got me here, in handcuffs, like some kind of criminal, and there's no record of it?" The assistant was silent for a moment, processing the absurdity of the situation. "I'm calling our legal team again." "Stay calm, we're going to get this figured out." He wanted to scream, to lash out, but he held back. This wasn't the time. His lawyer had made the calls, but the system wasn't moving fast enough. In this moment, it felt like everything he had built was crumbling away, like his entire future was now in the hands of a few officers who could decide his fate on a whim. His mind raced, thinking about the next step, the move that could shift the balance of power in his favor. He had always believed that actions spoke louder than words, that standing up for what was right meant taking control of the narrative. This was his story to tell. And if he had to, he would tell it on his own terms. The officers were growing impatient, shifting their weight from one foot to the other, clearly eager to get this over with. But he wasn't going to make it easy for them. He wasn't just going to sit back and let them walk all over him. He had earned his place in this world, and he wasn't going to let anyone take that from him. He could feel the fire inside him burning brighter. He wasn't just going to fight for his own freedom, he was going to fight for every black person who had ever been mistreated, who had been denied the right to live without fear. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about a fight for justice, for equality, for the rights of a people who had been silenced for far too long. As the minutes passed, he realized one thing: he wasn't going to leave this place a victim. He would leave a warrior, a man who refused to be broken, no matter the cost. The hours seemed to drag on as the tension in the terminal mounted, each moment feeling heavier than the last. His wrists ached from the handcuffs, and the realization that his fate was in the hands of people who saw him only for his skin began to sink in deeper. But he refused to let that truth break him. He had come too far, fought too hard, and endured too much to allow this moment to define his life. The officers remained silent, watching him as if they were waiting for him to crumble. But he wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. His mind raced with possibilities, strategies, and ways to reclaim control of the narrative. The thought of his legacy, his business, his employees, the people who depended on him, flashed before him. He could not fail them now. He couldn't fail the people who had invested their trust in him. As he sat there, alone in the sterile, dimly lit room, a new fire burned inside him. It was no longer just about his freedom, his career, or even his own dignity. It was about standing up for something bigger. It was about ensuring that his experience wasn't just another tragic story of racial injustice, buried and forgotten, but a moment that sparked change. A moment that would resonate far beyond this airport terminal. His phone buzzed again, the screen lighting up with another message from his lawyer. "We're still working on it, but the police are being difficult," the message read. The sense of helplessness surged within him again, but he pushed it down. He would not let himself fall into despair. Not now. Not ever. He had been through too much. Too many obstacles. Too many people had tried to knock him down over the years, but he always got back up. He wasn't going to let a few racist officers strip that away from him. It wasn't just about proving them wrong, it was about showing the world that someone like him, someone who had fought tooth and nail to rise above, would not be brought down by ignorance and hatred. The officers were still standing near him, exchanging whispers, probably deciding what to do next. He could feel the eyes of those around him, people who had witnessed the entire exchange, watching with a mixture of curiosity, disbelief, and unease. They could see what was happening. They could feel the injustice, too. His mind shifted to the bigger picture. He had been fortunate, yes, but so many others like him were not. The countless black men and women who faced this kind of oppression on a daily basis, who were subjected to profiling, harassment, and even violence, without a voice. They had no platform, no way to tell their stories, to demand accountability. But now, in this moment, he had the opportunity to change that. He wasn't going to let this pass quietly. He would make sure that his story, his fight, would be heard. No matter how long it took, no matter how much it cost him, he would make them listen. This was his call to action. He would not remain silent. He would stand tall and fight. For himself, yes. But more importantly, for everyone who had been silenced, for everyone who had been told they did not matter. As the minutes continued to pass, he made a vow to himself: this moment, this injustice, would not be forgotten. He would make it known to the world, and no one would ever be able to ignore the truth again. It had been hours, and the frustration in the air was palpable. He could feel the tension mounting with every passing second as the officers continued their impassive surveillance. They hadn't said much since the initial confrontation, and the silence only made him more determined to keep his composure. But inside, everything was different. His heart pounded, his thoughts raced, and the sharp sting of injustice clawed at his chest. He wasn't a criminal, he wasn't even a threat, but to them, he was just another black man to be controlled, to be put in his place. He had long known the dangers of being black in America, but to experience it firsthand, especially in the heart of his success, was a sobering reality. His phone buzzed again, pulling him from his spiraling thoughts. It was another call from his lawyer. He answered it quickly, his voice steady but laced with growing impatience. "What's going on?" "We've escalated it to the highest levels. People are making calls, but the airport security is dragging their feet." "It's taking longer than expected," the lawyer said. The lack of urgency in his voice hit him like a cold splash of water. "This is insane," he muttered, trying to keep the frustration out of his. Voice. How much longer? We're doing everything we can. Just stay calm, okay? His lawyer's words were meant to reassure him, but they fell flat. Calm? How could he stay calm when every second felt like a betrayal of everything he had worked for? He had spent his entire life proving that he was worthy of success, worthy of respect, and yet here he was, trapped in an airport terminal, treated as if he were less than human. The absurdity of the situation was overwhelming. He had risen to the top of his industry, built a multi-million-dollar company, been an inspiration to others, but in the eyes of these officers, none of that mattered. He could feel the heat of rage building inside him again. He wasn't going to let them break him, he couldn't. This wasn't just a fight for his freedom, it was a fight for the dignity of every black person who had been wronged by a system built on racism. He had been fortunate, yes, to get as far as he had, but too many others weren't. Too many others had been denied opportunities, harassed by law enforcement, or subjected to violence simply because of their skin color. He wasn't going to let that go unnoticed. As the officers continued to linger, showing no signs of backing down, he realized something. He could sit here, powerless, and wait for others to act, or he could take control of the narrative himself. His mind sharpened. This was his moment. Not just to escape this situation, but to make a stand. The world needed to hear this story. His story. The story of every black person who had ever been held back, oppressed, or silenced. This wasn't just about him anymore, it was about something much bigger. His heart thudded in his chest as the realization sank in. This was the moment that could change everything. He would use his voice, his power, to ensure that what was happening here wasn't swept under the rug. He would speak out, not only for himself but for the countless others who didn't have the platform to fight back. He would not be silenced. He would fight back with everything he had, and he would make sure that the world knew what had happened here. This was his turning point, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. As the minutes stretched on, he could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him even more. His body was stiff from sitting for so long in those handcuffs, but it wasn't the physical discomfort that bothered him most, it was the mental toll, the realization that his entire career, his reputation, everything he had worked so hard for, was being jeopardized by an act of discrimination. He had been sitting in that chair for what felt like hours, with no end in sight, no movement on his release, and no resolution in sight. The officers were still standing around him, their presence cold and unyielding, their faces impassive. He could feel their judgment weighing down on him, but he refused to let it break him. He wasn't going to give them that power. Not now. Not ever. He had climbed too high, fought too hard, and sacrificed too much to let this be the defining moment of his life. He could feel the anger bubbling up inside him again, but it was different this time. It wasn't just the anger of being wronged, it was the anger of knowing that this was the reality for so many black people in America, for those who didn't have the platform or the resources to fight back. He had spent his life trying to rise above the limitations others placed on him, but in this moment, it was clear that no matter how much success he achieved, he would always be seen through the lens of his skin color. He wasn't a CEO. He wasn't a businessman. To them, he was just a black man, and that was all that mattered. The thought hit him like a punch to the gut, but he wasn't going to let it stop him. His phone buzzed again, and this time, it was a message from his assistant. "We've got a plan. Someone from the city's mayor's office is coming to help," it said. He read the message, his heart racing. This could be the break he needed. He quickly typed back, "Get them here now. I'm not leaving until this is handled." The officers remained where they were, seemingly indifferent to the fact that he had just received help. They continued to keep their distance, eyes fixed on him as though they were waiting for something. He wasn't sure what it was, but he wasn't going to wait around any longer for someone to come and fix this. His anger was now transformed into something much more focused, determination. He wasn't going to let them win. He wasn't going to let this moment define him. He could feel his resolve strengthening with each passing second. He had spent too much of his life being underestimated, being doubted, to allow this to be the moment where he gave up. He was a fighter, and this fight wasn't over yet. As the sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the hallway, he knew that this was the moment of truth. He was about to make his stand. He wasn't just going to be another statistic, another victim of a broken system. He was going to make sure his voice was heard, and no matter what it took, he was going to make sure the world knew what had happened to him. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about justice. It was about equality. It was about ensuring that this kind of treatment would never happen again. As the footsteps grew louder, his pulse quickened. He could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the calm before the storm. His phone had buzzed again, confirming that help was on the way, but it still felt like an eternity. He looked at the officers standing around him, their postures still rigid, their faces unreadable. They were expecting him to crack, to break under the pressure, but he wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. He had endured much worse in his life, and he had learned the hard way that nothing came without a fight. But this wasn't just a fight for his freedom. It was a fight for something bigger, something more significant. It was a fight to expose the system that had allowed this to happen, that had allowed the authorities to treat him as less than human, to see him only for the color of his skin, not for the person he was. His thoughts were interrupted as the door to the terminal room opened, and a man stepped inside. He was wearing a dark suit, and his confident stride immediately drew the attention of the officers. It was clear that this man had power, influence, and, most importantly, he was there to help. The officer who had been standing nearest to the CEO took a step back, a subtle sign of respect, as the new arrival approached. The man extended his hand to the CEO, who had not moved from his seat, but instead met the gesture with a steady, unwavering gaze. "I'm here to help," the man said, his voice calm and authoritative. "We're getting you out of here." The CEO stood, the handcuffs still tight around his wrists, but his body language now radiated a quiet confidence. He knew this wasn't over, not yet. Not by a long shot. "Thank you," he said, his voice controlled but full of the emotion he had been holding back for hours. The man nodded, then turned to the officers. "This situation is being handled. There will be an investigation into the conduct of your department, and I expect full cooperation." The officers didn't respond immediately, but the tension in the room was palpable. It was as if they knew their time was running out, that the moment of reckoning was finally upon them. As the man continued to speak with the officers, the CEO felt the weight of the handcuffs start to lift, but it wasn't just the physical weight. It was the emotional weight, the burden of knowing that this moment, this injustice, was about to be exposed for the world to see. This was bigger than one black CEO. This was about a system that had been built to oppress, to silence, to diminish the worth of people like him. But he wasn't going to let that happen. Not anymore. He had been given a platform, and he was going to use it. His story was no longer just his own. It was a rallying cry for every person who had ever been marginalized, who had ever been told they were not enough, simply because of the way they looked. The officers left, and the handcuffs were finally removed. As they were taken off, he felt the release, but there was no sense of triumph in that moment. Not yet. He was still processing everything that had just happened, the sheer weight of the experience that had just unfolded. But one thing was clear, he wasn't going to walk away from this. He would make sure the world heard his voice, heard the stories of countless others like him, whose lives had been upended by a system that valued them less. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The handcuffs were finally removed, and the weight on his wrists disappeared, but the tension in his chest remained, a constant reminder of what had just happened. He stood there for a moment, taking a deep breath, grounding himself. The man in the suit, who had come to his aid, gave him a sympathetic nod, but there was no time to exchange pleasantries. This was far from over. The officers had left the room, but the stain of their actions lingered. He knew the fight had just begun. His mind was racing with everything he needed to do. He needed to make a statement, to tell the world what had happened to him, to expose the injustice that still ran rampant in the system. This moment, this infuriating, humiliating experience, was not something he could let go of. It wasn't just about him anymore, it was about something much bigger. The suit-clad man turned to him again, his face more serious now. "You're free to go, but we need to take action now," he said, his voice firm with authority. "We're going to ensure this doesn't happen again. You're going to make sure it doesn't." The CEO looked him in the eye, nodding, knowing the gravity of the situation. He had been quiet for too long, and this had opened his eyes to the reality that no amount of success, no amount of wealth, could shield him from the systemic racism that still plagued society. "I won't just walk away from this," he said, his voice calm, but with an underlying resolve. "I'll make sure the world knows what happened." The man's lips curled into a small, approving smile. "Good. We need people like you to lead the charge." He looked at the CEO one last time, then turned to leave. As the door closed behind him, the CEO exhaled deeply, finally feeling like he could breathe again. The battle, however, was far from over. He knew the road ahead would be long, and he knew the forces that had worked to keep him in that situation would not let him off easily. But he had made his decision. He was going to fight. He was going to stand up for himself, yes, but more importantly, he was going to stand up for all the people who had suffered in silence, who had been overlooked or worse, oppressed by a system that did not value them. He was going to make sure that their stories were heard, and he was going to make sure that their pain was not swept under the rug. His lawyer called again, and this time, the news was good. The mayor's office had stepped in, and there was now a full investigation into the officer's actions. It wasn't over, but it was a start. He hung up the phone, his mind made up. He would not let this moment be forgotten, and he wouldn't let his fight go unheard. The system that had tried to break him was going to have to answer for what had happened. As he walked out of the airport, free at last, he knew this was only the beginning. He had a new mission now. A new purpose. To make sure that his story, and the stories of so many others, would never be silenced again. The weight of the moment slowly lifted as he stepped out of the airport, the bright sunlight hitting his face like a reminder that he was no longer trapped in that sterile, oppressive room. His body was free, but his mind remained sharp, focused on the battle that was far from over. As he walked through the terminal, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was a defining moment in his life. It wasn't just about the incident that had unfolded, it was about what came next. The fight for justice, for equality, was no longer a distant cause, it was his cause. The fight for change was now his responsibility. He had spent years building his business, climbing the corporate ladder, proving that a black man could succeed in a world that often overlooked him, but he knew that success alone wasn't enough. Now, he had the platform, and with that platform came the duty to speak up, to fight for those who had been silenced, who had been oppressed by the very systems that had allowed him to rise. He couldn't let this moment be reduced to just another headline. This wasn't just about him, it was about every person who had ever been subjected to discrimination, every black individual who had ever been mistreated by a system that was supposed to protect them, not break them. He had been forced into a corner, made to feel small and powerless, but now, he had the chance to turn the tables. As he walked through the airport, his phone buzzed again. It was a message from his assistant. The news outlets are picking up the story. People are starting to talk. This isn't just a local issue anymore, it's national. His heart raced. This was it, the beginning of the conversation he had been wanting to have for years, the conversation that needed to happen, the one that was long overdue. He couldn't help but feel a surge of both pride and anxiety. This wasn't just about the news coverage, it was about the larger fight for racial justice. It was about exposing the truth, about ensuring that what happened to him wasn't brushed aside as a one-time incident, but as a clear example of the systemic issues that needed to be addressed. He wasn't going to let this story be forgotten. He was going to make sure that his voice, and the voices of so many others, were heard loud and clear. As he exited the terminal, he looked up at the sky, his mind racing with thoughts of the fight ahead. The legal battles, the public scrutiny, the changes that needed to be made, there was a long road ahead, and he was ready to walk it. He had fought too hard to get to this point, and he wasn't going to back down now. The officers who had wrongfully detained him may have thought they were silencing him, but they had only made him louder. They had awakened a fire in him that would not be extinguished. He had made a promise to himself, and to every person who had been oppressed, that he would never back down, never stop fighting for what was right. As he walked away from the airport, he knew that the battle for justice was just beginning, and he was ready to lead the charge.